Hello, this video is to walk you through the SLD eligibility form. As a reminder, you can find the copy of the exemplar and guidance form that I'm showing you, that I'm walking through right now, in the RSU 10 Special Education classroom in the School Psychologist's Corner under exemplar forms, right here. You will use this form anytime that SLD was a part of a referral question. That includes whether or not the student actually presents with an SLD, if one was found or not found during testing. You will use this form to indicate whether they qualify or do not qualify. The first thing that you need to indicate on this form is whether or not the student is achieving at a state-approved grade level in terms of their academic achievement. If the student is achieving at grade level, you would say yes, and then this form is really fast, because if you say yes to number 1, you are all done, and you provide your verification down here and then proceed all the way to the end of the form. Most of the time, though, if we proceeded with an evaluation in the first place, the answer is going to be no, and you're going to come down here and indicate which areas is the student not achieving adequately. So in the case of this particular exemplar student, we would indicate basic reading skill and reading fluency. It's worth noting you're only going to check boxes in which you have verification. So if you happen to suspect or know, because you have the student in your class, that oral expression or listening comprehension are issues, but they are not issues that were explicitly tested during this particular evaluation, you're not going to check those boxes. This happens sometimes because these two areas in particular were put on this form because they are tested on the Wyatt, which is one of the more commonly used achievement tests, but they are not tested on the Woodcock-Johnson. So if Marie was the person who did the academic achievement testing for this student, you may not have any information here unless the student also has, for example, a speech and language evaluation. So even if you know that there's a problem, you're only going to check it if there's verification available to you. And then you're going to put that verification down here in the box. This area highlighted in yellow indicates some of the most commonly used acceptable sources that you could use for that information. So things like, as I already mentioned, Wyatt and Woodcock-Johnson. But you also could use things like standards-based grades, Ames Web, PSAT or SAT scores, NUIA scores, all those kinds of things can go here as well. You're going to indicate what your data source was, who did it, what was their name, and what are their credentials if they have credentials. What was the date that this testing was done, approximately. You see this is June 2019, so you don't need to specify, June 4th, 2019, but month and year, who the person was, what is the score, and then what does that score mean? As I indicated on the adverse effect form video, if you have watched that, it's important that we provide what the score means because the number by itself doesn't give context. You see up here a DRA level 34, a NUIA 190, and a GORT 5 score of 72. Those numbers are all radically different, and yet they all actually mean something similar, which is that the student isn't meeting grade level standards. You want to, in thinking ahead, if the student's going to qualify, you can also go ahead at this point in filling out the form. You can just copy the information in this box and don't do anything with it right away, but copy it so it's in your computer's clipboard. This is one of the very, very few instances in special ed paperwork in which you get to use the same information in multiple boxes. So once you've answered question 1, if you've answered no to question 1 and you're proceeding with eligibility, the next question you need to answer is, if the student's not achieving adequately, is the underachievement due to lack of appropriate instruction? Most of the time, we're going to say no, and we're going to use the statement that student has received consistent instruction from highly qualified teachers, because most of the time that statement is true. If for some reason that statement is not true, you're going to indicate there's right here down in the blue, a little statement that describes some reasons why the statement might not be true. You're going to reflect that here. The department also gives you some things to consider. So things like if the student has moved around a lot, they've been pulled from school, they got homeschool instruction that we're not sure was the most rigorous instruction that would have been appropriate. If they've been incredibly truant, those are all reasons why we might say yes here. And this is the reason why I know sometimes we've had some conflict between some teachers, not necessarily special ed teachers, but some teachers and school psychologists in evaluating SLD for students who have been truant. If we do a whole evaluation and we find cognitive processing deficits, but the student has been truant, we have to say yes here because we can't prove that the student's academic deficits aren't related to the truancy. And so if we've checked yes, the student doesn't qualify, even though they've been through all the testing. So that's why we tend to wait until the student has demonstrated some consistent attendance before we proceed with an evaluation. So assuming that we've said no to box 2, we move along to box 3. Box 3 is actually a series of several boxes that are all rule outs. And for each rule out, we have to provide some level of verification. Sometimes it's simple and sometimes it's a little bit more complex. So for visual, hearing, or motor disability, if they do not have visual, hearing, or motor disability, we're going to indicate that the student has passed screenings. This is another reason why oftentimes for students who have failed vision screenings or hearing screenings at school, the psych team recommends holding off on evaluation because we need to have verification that they don't have these disabilities. And if they failed a vision screening and they haven't received a follow-up assessment, we don't have proof that there's not a visual impairment that's affecting the student's achievement. So read the blue for more information if you're filling this out without watching the video. For intellectual disability, we generally need to provide one of two things. Either cognitive scores that are within the average to above average range for that student's age group, because that rules out intellectual disability based on cognitive information, or we need some adaptive scores that are within the average range, because adaptive scores in the average range rule out intellectual disability. So you're going to provide some of this information in some way. I've provided for you on this exemplar form a few different iterations of what that might look like. So if you have a nice a full scale IQ score or some other big composite score, such as the expanded fluid index score, you're going to indicate that that's probably your easiest route. And this paragraph here tells you the tests and the composite scores on those tests that you might use. So as a quick example, on the WISC or the WACE, you could use the full scale IQ, general ability index, nonverbal index, expanded fluid index, or verbal crystallized index. Any of those would be fine. If none of those were able to be calculated for some reason due to really discrepant scores, section 2 here talks about what to do when there's not a composite score available. In that case, you basically indicate, you're going to talk a little bit about the test, who did it and when they did it, and indicate that they have a pattern of strengths and weaknesses that is not consistent with an intellectual disability. If the student's actually an appropriate rule out because we assessed for SLD, but their pattern is actually more consistent with intellectual disability, you're going to indicate that. Here's a composite score that's in the well below average range. This is a child whose pattern is more suggestive of intellectual disability. C asks you to rule out an emotional disturbance. So if rating scales were administered as part of the evaluation for SLD as well, then you would indicate here if they were both assessed but ED was ruled out, kind of follow this top part here. So you're going to indicate, in that case, usually what that means is rating scales came back in the average range. If you're answering yes to this one, SLD and ED were both assessed, but we've ruled out SLD and indicated ED is the more appropriate, then you're going to talk about those rating scales probably being in the clinically significant range, and you're going to answer yes. If you're proceeding down a path that's more likely to be a multiple disabilities path, then you're going to use a verification statement similar to the one listed here. So they have clinically significant stuff. However, they also have a pattern of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, which we're going to talk about in the next section. So you would reference that in your verification statement. In the frequent situation in which ED was never a concern for the student, so we don't have rating scale scores, we don't have anything that would ever suggest an ED, then you can simply say something like assessment history and school records don't support the presence of that. So that's a lot of our kids who really sincerely only have academic stuff going on, but they're otherwise meeting expectations at school, seem to be emotionally and socially well adjusted. D is typically a quick one. We very often say no. Most of the time, the verification is going to be this statement here. If you have a student who is an English language learner, using a statement like this one down here is probably more appropriate. So including a statement such as, although he's from a bilingual home, and then you're going to reference things like the ELL support that the student receives and what access scores look like, which is the test that the ELL teachers generally give to our English language learning students. If that's the case, it's really important that the evaluation was actually approached from a lens of providing an appropriate and reliable and valid assessment for a student who's an English language learner. It's often approached differently than for a student who's not an English language learner. So if you have any question as to whether that was actually done, the report should very explicitly state that the evaluator knew the student was an English language learner and used XYZ test or approach because of that. If you see that there, that's probably fine. If you don't see that there, bring the evaluation to someone on the site team so that we can look at that and make a determination about whether it was appropriate. So once you've done all of that, if any of those questions were yes, the student is not going to qualify under SLD and you move to the end. But if they're all no, then you're going to move to question 4. Question 4 is the matrix, the grid, where you're going to indicate the pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And you do that in 4 different areas. A refers to basically RTI. How has the student responded to the intervention that we have provided them? We often look at things like Ames Web scores, especially for students who are in reevaluation. Generally looking for things like, are they making progress? And generally, the strength is going to be the progress that they're making, whereas the weakness is going to be that they're still behind grade level. Or sometimes at the high school level, we're looking at things like, they're doing well, they're earning passing grades in their special education classes, but the weakness is that they require specially designed instruction in order to get those passing grades. Or if they're in the general education setting, perhaps the weakness is that they still require support in advanced study skills in order to be successful in the general education setting. So this is basically where we're reflecting on what we're providing for intervention and how are they responding to it. For an initial referral, it's often how did they respond to Title I instruction prior to coming to us. B looks at classroom performance data, and that means specifically gen ed classroom performance data. So strength on the left, weakness on the right. You want to include specific grades when you can. C and D often are looking at specific evaluation data. This is where if you have copied the information from box 1, you're going to paste that in the weaknesses box for C, because that's the weaknesses in terms of achievement. Strengths are going to use the same type of information, but you're going to pull out what went well. So for this particular student, this is a nice clear-cut reading disability. They met standards in math. They did not meet standards in reading.